Zombies are living dead men normally found on the island of Haiti and occasionally in parts of Africa. They are believed to be the corpses of men and women that have been raised from their graves by magic and then sent out to perform all manner of tasks. These jobs can be anything from working in the fields, gathering in crops, to carrying out revenge on their master's enemies. The creatures look horrifying, as you can imagine, usually being dressed in the clothes they were buried in. They have blank faces and great staring eyes. They also only respond to the commands of the person who has raised them, and walk with stiff, jerky movements, quite oblivious of anything or anybody around them. Most people wisely get out of the way of zombies and avoid any places where they are known to be. According to legend, the only way to stop one is to make it eat some salt, for this apparently causes it to regain its power of thought once more and return to the grave where it can at last lie in peace. It's a rather chilling subject, isn't it? And one you might only ever expect to come across in faraway places. Until recently, I could never imagine hearing a zombie story in England, but I have done now, and although there are some elements of the tale that differ from those told in Haiti and Africa, there is little doubt in my mind that the Zombie of Gladwish Wood fully deserves its title. The place where these horrible events took place is at first sight about as unlikely a spot for such things as you could hope to find. It was on the South Downs, in fact, that beautiful stretch of rolling countryside which covers a good part of Sussex, between Tunbridge Wells in the north and Eastbourne on the coast in the south. The precise locality is Burwash, famous as the home of the great writer Rudyard Kipling, who immortalised the place in his story Puck of Pook's Hill. Not far from where Kipling lived, in a magnificent 17th century house called Bateman's, stands a small, rather lonesome-looking group of trees known as Gladwish Wood. Kipling himself knew the place well and thought there was something very strange about it, as he once told a friend. "It is full of a sense of ancient ferocity and evil," he said. "Everything in it seems to be evil. The paths around it are alive with adders. The roots of the trees seem to be contorted by the devil and are always waiting to trip one up. The clinging, trailing brambles reach out to tear one's eyes with a horrible suggestion of intelligence. It's not empty. There's too much life there, a kind of ill-natured and venomous life." When pressed to explain just what sort of life he meant, Kipling would only answer enigmatically that it was a spirit of some kind, a very impolite fellow too. This opinion of Gladwish Wood has been shared by many people living in the area, and it has retained its evil reputation for years. One person, however, had reason to believe it was more than just a feeling, or even an old legend, for he came face to face with what he called the Zombie of Gladwish Wood. Arthur Warnford, the man who had the encounter, is dead now, but older people in Burwash who knew him remember him as a sensible and down-to-earth fellow who did not let his imagination run away with him. Yet what he saw and experienced was straight from the realms of nightmare, although he swore to his dying day that every word of it was true. Arthur was a short, stocky man in his late 50s when the events happened. Born and brought up in Burwash, he had been a farm worker in the area all his life and knew and loved the locality. He also had a countryman's insight into the ways of nature and was not one to lightly dismiss old tales, because he knew there was always a certain amount of truth in them somewhere. Although Arthur spent most of his days in the open, he still had a passion for walking and had covered hundreds of miles of the South Downs during his lifetime. He also enjoyed rambling in the small woods and forests that dotted the area, and it was this passion that brought him back at fairly regular intervals to Gladwish Wood. As Arthur later confessed, he was also rather intrigued by the wood. It had had a reputation for being haunted for many years, and he found there was something a bit exciting about wandering through it as evening fell. As he was not married, spare time was something that he had plenty of, and there was no one to urge him to hurry back to his little cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was a late September evening in 1956 when Arthur's steps had once again taken him to the edge of Gladwish Wood. Darkness had not yet started to fall, although there was a gathering sense of gloom about the place. Nevertheless, it did not deter Arthur in his plan to walk through the copse on his way home. Besides, to go round it would add over a mile to his journey, and he had to admit he was starting to feel a little tired and hungry. He knew the path through the wood almost like the back of his hand, and plunged into the trees without a second thought. Inside, everything seemed much the same as ever. He could hear the twittering of birds up in the topmost branches of the trees as they gathered together to settle down for the night, while in the undergrowth all around he heard the occasional rustling and scuffling as small animals and insects fled before his approaching footsteps. Arthur walked on at a steady pace, occasionally whistling and swinging the ash stick he always carried like a walking stick. His mind wandered over some of the problems of the day, and then briefly began to debate what he would get himself for supper when he got home. He was hardly conscious of how quickly night was falling until he realized he had strayed from his usual path. He gave a small shake of his head in annoyance and got himself back on the right track. As he did so, he became aware that the familiar sounds of the wood had suddenly changed. Now there was a sense of brooding about everything. From ahead came an angry hiss, and then a thin, piercing scream which seemed to shiver through the air. For just a moment, Arthur was startled, then quickly told himself the sounds were ordinary enough. The hiss had probably come from an owl perched up in one of the trees, while the shriek was more than likely that of a rabbit which had been caught by the sharp teeth of a stoat. Still, he increased the pace of his walk and kept a sharp eye on the track ahead of him. Although he was by no stretch of the imagination frightened, he sensed again, as he had done on previous occasions, why Gladwish Wood had earned its reputation. It was eerie at night. He must have covered about half a mile through the wood when he was aware of the total silence which had settled about him. Not a sound disturbed the gathering gloom, not a shadow moved amongst the dark, towering shapes of the trees. That was odd, he told himself. Suddenly, he was aware of something in the wood with him. It was not as if he could hear anything at first. It was just a countryman's instinct that told him he was not alone. The absence of animal sounds was the first clue that he was right. For a moment, Arthur thought he would stop and listen, but a feeling inside made him keep on walking. The silence grew even more intense. Then his senses picked up something at almost the same moment that his ears did. He was being followed. The sounds became clearer. The something was hurrying through the undergrowth behind him, and whatever it was moving very quickly. Now Arthur Warneford experienced the first pangs of anxiety. He knew only too well that if you got off the path through Gladwish Wood, you were very quickly caught up in either masses of brambles or patches of cloying, treacherous mud. Yet by the direction from which the sounds were coming, the something was moving through these obstructions almost as if they didn't exist. That seemed to rule out a human being. So could it be a fox, he asked himself. No, that didn't seem likely. A fox rarely made much noise, and certainly not when it was hunting prey. A dog, then? Again, this seemed unlikely, for domestic animals were known to have a decided aversion to the wood. Arthur hurried on, now beginning to wonder if it had been such a good idea to come this way. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination playing tricks on him, but the sounds got more distinct and closer behind him. It began to sound really rather like some large object blundering through the undergrowth. All of a sudden, Arthur was aware that he must have got onto the wrong path. In his haste, he had obviously missed a turning, because he was now entering a small clearing he had come through once already. He must have walked in a circle, for he was back in the centre of the wood again. He could no longer kid himself that he was not worried. His heart was pounding, and he could feel sweat breaking out on his forehead. If he could have seen his face in the gloom, he would have seen that it had gone rather pale too. And now the something was crashing through the trees just beyond the rim of the clearing. For the first time since he had entered the wood, Arthur Warneford stopped. He turned to face the direction the sounds were coming from. Seconds passed like an eternity. Then the something blundered out of the shadows and into the clearing. Even in the gloom, Arthur saw at once it was a human figure. But the kind of human figure he had never expected to see outside a nightmare. The shape was that of a man, and it seemed to come forward in a jerky motion, its hands alternately straight out in front of it, and then apparently pulling at its throat as if it was choking. It seemed to be making a sound halfway between a cough and a moan. Arthur Warneford felt the hair on the back of his neck rise like the hackles of a dog, and his legs seemed to go weak underneath him. He stood rooted to the spot. The man-figure took a few more lumbering steps forward. The arms waved again and clutched at the throat. It seemed to be dressed in a long, ragged coat, for when the arms moved, they seemed to Arthur to flap, almost like the wings of a bird. But it was not the body or arms that froze him with horror. For the figure had a head that was little more than a skull, its eyes set deep in a yellow, withered and decayed face. They seemed to stare straight ahead and right through Arthur, as if looking into his very soul. Nor was that all, for the head was set on a long, thin neck, which was also horribly wizened. And as the creature lumbered forward, it caused the head to bob crazily from side to side. Later, Arthur was to recall that it looked uncannily like a spring daffodil shaking in the wind. In that moment, as the figure lumbered towards him across the clearing, Arthur knew instinctively that this was a man who had been dead and buried for years, and something about the long neck also made him think the man might have been hanged. The sudden realization of this knowledge seemed to release him from his paralysis. As the awful shambling figure with its staring face was almost upon him, his mind flung his body into action. The next few moments were like something in a dream that Arthur Warneford could never quite clearly remember. He remembered suddenly being aware again of the stout ash stick in his hand. He remembered raising it above his head and then bringing it down with all his terrified strength on the thing that was about to overwhelm him. But his mind did not remember experiencing the feeling of wood striking flesh, or even bone, only of a great blackness descending over him and the sensation of falling. How long Arthur Warneford lay unconscious, he was not sure. It could have been only seconds, or as long as several minutes, before he was aware of a dampness against his face. His eyes opened slowly to find that he was spread-eagled on the earth in the middle of the gloomy clearing. In one hand he could see half of his walking stick, the end broken and splintered. Nearby lay the other half, also shattered. But of the terrible thing, there was no sign whatsoever. Arthur stood up slowly and looked carefully around to see that he had not been mistaken. He shook his head in a mixture of horror and disbelief. What on earth could it have been that walked away from a blow that broke a stout ash stick in half? The whole experience had been so extraordinary. Could he be sure he had hit anything at all? The broken stick in his hand seemed to be the proof that he had, and the way his clothes stuck to his sweat-soaked body added to his conviction that he had truly undergone a frightful encounter. As he stood in the darkened clearing, brushing down his clothes and regaining his composure, Arthur realized that the wood had once more returned to normal. The undergrowth was again alive with small rustlings, and occasional flutterings came from the branches above his head. It seemed that the wild creatures of the wood were sure that the thing which had silenced them before had now gone. Who or what that thing was the question that now puzzled Arthur as he began to retrace his steps along the path which took him to the other side of the wood. He was now in no doubt that the place was haunted, but with something far more frightening than any ordinary ghost. Although he was not quite sure why, he found himself at that moment naming the creature the Zombie of Gladwish Wood, and so it has remained. Once he was safely home again, and comforting himself with a steaming hot cup of tea in front of a roaring fire, Arthur went back over the events of the night. Although he was quite clear about what happened until the moment he had struck out at the horror, it was the loss of memory of the following few seconds that disturbed him. On the one hand, he felt he could remember the sound of splintering bones under the impact of his stick, but on the other, he knew this could equally have been the noise of the ash splintering. But this proved he must have struck something. What he was totally convinced of was the reality of what he had experienced. And indeed, he demonstrated that when he calmly related the facts to his friends, and later to the psychic investigator, Thurston Hopkins, who in turn provided me with the notes for this account. Mr. Hopkins, in fact, went back to Gladwish Wood several times to try and find out more about its terrible zombie. He even organised a ghost hunt, and although one of the participants reported hearing strange crashing noises in the undergrowth, which sounded like a body stumbling about, the evidence was not convincing enough to be regarded as positive. What Mr. Hopkins did discover, though, was a possible explanation as to who the zombie might have been. For as a result of some intensive research into the history of the Burwash district, he discovered that in 1825 a man had been hanged for a murder allegedly committed in the wood. Afterwards, his body had been buried in the copse. The man's name was apparently David Leaney, and he had gone to his death protesting all along that he was innocent. Then, after the execution, fresh medical evidence was brought to light which showed that the supposed murder victim had actually died of a heart attack. According to the report which Thurston Hopkins found, Leaney had become friendly during his final hours with the local parson who came to comfort him. And his very last words to this parson before his execution had been, "I beg of you to believe me when I say that I am innocent of this crime, and to prove it I shall return to haunt those people who have hounded me to death." Although it has never been proved that Arthur Warnford was in any way related to the Burwash people who so mercilessly condemned the innocent Leaney to death, it does leave one grim possibility about the zombie of Gladwish Wood, that it was indeed the dead alive body of David Leaney once again returning to carry out his terrible promise.